Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzifeay. I'm going to take a slightly different tack for the next series of Book Bag interviews. We'll still be finding authors and chatting to them about their work, but in some cases I'm going to be taking a slightly deeper dive into what motivates them, what inspires them, what their process is. And I'm also going to invite back into the book bag some of my absolute favourite interviewees from the past, just to catch up with them, see how they're doing. So the first up for this, I'm very delighted to say, is one of my absolute favourite children's authors. It's Philip Womack. Hello, Philip.
I'm grinning all over. Delighted.
Ears were burning. But the amazing thing about you, Philip, is I think you were the very first person that I interviewed for Book Bag.
That's right, yeah.
You joined me on this adventure.
Well,
it's taken either of us, I do not know, but we're still here and we're still having fun. And most importantly, we're still friends. So,
yeah, exactly.
So to join me into this slightly more psychological look at what makes Philip Womack, the author, tick, I have a series of questions, new questions. And my first question, I want to take you back to sort of little Diddy Philip and ask, who was the first author that you registered as an author? You know, like, wow, this is somebody who creates these worlds that I love being in. Was there someone where you suddenly thought, incredible, that's what an author is?
That's a really good question. I think I was always really quite alive to prose, and I remember being really affected by a book called Gobelino the Witch's Cat, which was by Ursula Moray Williams, and I was only about 4 or 5. But some of those books that I read as an early reader really still stay with me. Even now, there was a book by somebody who wrote Doctor Who, I think, where a girl goes backwards through a telescope up to the moon, and that sort of still haunts me, that book. But in terms of authors and really starting to appreciate what it meant to create a world that I could live in as a child, I think it's 3 authors in particular, and the first one is C.S. Lewis. And the Narnia books, and I mean all of them. I'm not one of those people who didn't get on with The Last Battle or didn't like The Horse and His Boy. I loved every single one of them, and every single one of them seemed to open out the world that he'd made even more. So I loved getting the extra bits about Calaman in The Horse and His Boy, and I loved getting the in The Last Battle, the sense that Narnia was fading and then moving into this, although at the time I didn't know it was platonic, but into this platonic other world that, you know, and they're going through all these versions of Narnia until they reach the further up and further in. You know, it's wonderful, that scene. So, and then there was also obviously Tolkien, and it wasn't The Hobbit for me. I actually don't recall reading The Hobbit. It was Lord of the Rings, which I read as a 12-year-old, I think 11 or 12-year-old, and I was absolutely hook, line and sinker, just drawn into it. Just so vastly imaginative and moving and vast, and on such a grand scale, unlike anything I'd read before. And alongside that was T.H. White's The Sword in the Stone. It's not really a trilogy. It's a sort of, it's 4 books really, but they're not really read now, which I think is a great shame. I think T.H. White deserves to be looked at, certainly by readers and critics, much more carefully. And those 4 books, and I think initially they're not really children's books. They're very, very adult. There's many scenes in those books which have a real deep adult resonance, and there's one that is so effective and strange, where the young children of Morgause, I think it is, the queen of Orkney, and they want her attention, and they think, oh, let's go and get a unicorn, and they dragoon a local girl to be the maiden, and the unicorn comes, and then they capture the unicorn and they kill it, and they cut the unicorn's head off, and they take the unicorn's head to their mother, and she doesn't even notice it. So they've committed this terrible crime. They've grown up. They've understood something really profound about human nature. And obviously, reading it as a child, I didn't grasp that at all. It just really affected me in ways I didn't understand. And I think that's a sign of a good children's book, is that you read it on one level as a child, and then when you come back to it, you sort of see the resonance in it. I recently wrote a little piece about Puck of Pook's Hill, which again was a book that really affected me deeply as a child, partly because it's set in Sussex, and I lived and grew up in Sussex. And Kipling himself said that he'd actually layered it with all these different things that adults would understand as they grew older. And I think that's so clever. I wish I could do it.
Well, I remember, and it is obviously a very famous scene, when Edmund betrays Lucy in the very first book. And that absolutely hits you as a child.
Yes.
There's no child who doesn't get the deep wrongness. And I think there's probably no child who hasn't felt that in some way, that an adult has really let them down or betrayed their sort of deepest secret or something. I mean, it's still painful to read. I mean, it's such an incredible scene. And like you say, it had adult emotions and adult kind of lessons in it. That it's just so resonant.
Yeah.
So those books, I mean, they're all marvelous. Was there a book that made you think maybe a book that's not quite so well thought out? Maybe you thought I could do better, or I can do this. Was there a point when you thought, no, I want to be an author?
I think actually, in terms of noticing that writing was inept, I think that I became a literary snob quite early on in my life. And because I graduated very, very quickly, there wasn't such a thing as YA when I was young, or if there was, it was all, issues and things like that. And I jumped very, very quickly from those books, Tolkien, T.H. White, so forth, into adult fiction. And so by the age of 13, I was reading Irvin Welsh, Jane Austen,
There's
William
a combo.
Golding. I know, but I've always been very eclectic in the way that I've approached reading, and that's always been both a boon and a problem, because it means that you get this sort of enormously wide range of things, but then also I tend to lack that more narrow focus. But yeah, so in terms of sort of ineptness, I think very early on I realised what clunky prose was, and what was cheap, what was sats, what was just kind of churned out. In terms of particular books, I actually do remember reading. I must have been about 14 or 15, and there was that film Interview with a Vampire.
Yes.
And I then went to read the first book, which I thought was brilliant. And I haven't reread it recently. I don't really want to reread it because. But then I remember reading the second one, which is called The Vampire Lestat. I think this is terrible, overwritten. It was mad. There was some passages in it that didn't make sense, and I remember thinking that at the time, like reading the words and thinking, this is bad writing. Like, how has this been published? How is this out in the world? So I don't think it, although I don't think it spurred me into being a writer, but I did certainly try and write this sort of sexy vampire novel at the age of sort of 15, which I think I sent to a publisher actually, and I think I got a reply about it. Sort of 10 years before Twilight or whatever it was.
Yeah, I mean, you anticipated that quite clearly. I mean, there was a time when sexy vampires were it. So many of us in the world of books have had an inspirational teacher, often an English teacher, and I wondered if you had somebody in mind.
I've been extraordinarily lucky in my English teachers and my classics teachers, and both sides, which are very important in my imaginative life. On the English side, my teacher at Lancing was Michelle Martindale, who was absolutely erudite and incredibly inspiring, and she could discourse on Hamlet for hours, and I was just happy to kind of drink in whatever it was that she said, and I thought she was absolutely wonderful. She's still alive. I was very, very lucky to have that kind of teaching and that kind of access to a mind that would engage with things in a very wide range and in very interesting ways. And she was always very encouraging of my inept adolescent prose. So looking back at the sort of overblown, sticking in a few ceruleans and kind of, hyacinthine. The hyacinthine sky drips with cerulean, kind of, the sort of classic. Edgar Allan Poe's sort of inspired, hitting the reader with his thesaurus kind of thing. Looking back on that, she was always very, challengingly encouraging about what good writing actually was. So yeah, definitely. And at university as well, at Oxford, I was just introduced to so many things by my tutors. Glenn Black, who just died recently, who was fully immersed in the 15th and 16th centuries, and I just was introduced to Philip Sidney in my first term, and it's just become an absolute passion. I just adore Philip Sidney. And one of the things I would like to do, Ian Pearce did an Arcadia. I don't know if you ever came across it.
I didn't read it. He's Instance of the Finger Post.
Yes, he did that. Yeah. So he likes those kind of layered narratives, and he did an Arcadia, which I read the reviews of, but I didn't read, partly because I didn't want to read it because I wanted to do something like that. But I'd love to use it somehow, but I haven't worked out a way of doing it yet.
Also, the wonderful Astrophil and Stella, the sonnet sequence.
The sonnet sequence is just amazing.
Which I came across at university, So, what is the most discouraging thing anybody's said to you in terms of your work? I mean, you had your prescient vampire novel just flung back in your face. I mean, the moral here is overcoming this discouragement. But I had somebody say to me, "You will never be a journalist, ever, ever. You have no talent whatsoever." So it's that sort of thing,
That's an interesting question. So the vampire novel, actually, I got, because I'd written in the letter, I'm 14 years old, or however old I was. I actually got quite a nice letter back from an editor, and I kept the letter somewhere, and it says we don't quite have room for this on our list, and then at the bottom in pencil it says you're only 14 or something, keep going. What's the most discouraging thing that people have said? The thing is, and I've learned to take it well, so that the book business is obviously led by commercial instincts, and so sometimes people will say, after you've put huge amounts of effort into an idea or a project or something, and they say, "Oh, well, that doesn't work at the moment," and that's very, very discouraging. But you just have to kind of pick yourself up and carry on, and that's something that affects every single writer. But I think the most discouraging thing that happened to me was right at the beginning of my writing career, when I was very lucky to be published by Bloomsbury at the time, who published my first two novels, and there'd been a bit of press about it because obviously Bloomsbury published Harry Potter, and so anyone who was published by Bloomsbury was then called the next J.K. Rowling, whether or not there was any valid claim to that title. It was my first novel. I was so excited about it, and the first Amazon review came out, and obviously I'm sort of Googling, and as writers do, and and the first thing that popped up was an Amazon review which said 1 star. This is nothing like Harry Potter. I don't know why I bothered reading this book. Avoid, or something like that. And it was absolutely crushing. But you in the end, you learn that you can't please everybody all the time. And even if you were to write the most perfect book in the world, there would still be somebody who wrote 1 star boring underneath the. So.
Have you ever done any judging? Because prize judging is very like that. You bounce into a meeting saying that you've found an absolute masterpiece, and somebody says the equivalent of 1 star boring.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah. No, it's really odd, that, isn't it? The different ways that people react to the same book. I have done quite a lot of judging in the past for various prizes, and that's definitely something I can resonate with.
Give me, this is a cheeky one, give me one surprising fact about you that people don't know.
Surprising fact about me that people don't know. Gosh. Well, I play the piano.
Yes, you do. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
play the piano. I love playing the piano. I've played it since I was 9. I'm not that good, but I kind of bash away and amuse myself. I do about 20 minutes a day. I would say probably most people wouldn't know that. Other than that, I'd have to think.
Other than that, it's just, right.
I mean,
Eat, sleep, repeat.
There's a couple of things I wouldn't necessarily want people to know.
True. Yes. Well, I said surprising fact. And I have also seen the music that is on your piano.
Yeah.
And it looks absolutely terrifying. I've even heard you play a bit. So.
Yeah, I'm learning Ravel's Ondine, and it's a very, very technically difficult piece. But I was told by my teacher that you have to just pretend it isn't difficult, and it is amazing how that works. And you just break it down into little chunks, and suddenly you can do it. So, and I guess that's a good metaphor for writing as well. And it really does help me. The two you were asking about process, and actually that is a very good tool, because if you're faced with a long piece of prose and you think you can't get to the end of it, then I just break it down and say, well, I'm going to get to the next paragraph, get to the next chapter, and do it like that in building blocks, and then it all flows together.
Is there an event that changed your life, or a moment where, you took this path rather than that path, or something that changed you as an individual?
Yeah, so when I left university, I didn't really know. Well, I wanted to be a journalist or a writer, or in that kind of vague way that most young literary people have, where they sort of think that they're going to be a Booker Prize winning novelist by the time they're 22 or something. And at university, almost everyone I knew seemed to have a path and seemed to know what they were doing. Of course, looking back on it, they didn't know either. But from my point of view, they all had a very clear path, and that was usually towards the professions. It was law, it was banking, it was teaching, it was working in the charity sector, or anything like that. But there was a defined path, and so I thought law would be really interesting, and so I did a year at law school, and I had a kind of training contract and all that sort of thing. And I then remember I took a year out because I wanted to decide whether to be a solicitor or a barrister, and I did some mini pupilages, which is where you go and sit with a barrister, and they're amazing people and eccentric and wonderful. And I then got work experience at Literary Review, which is this lovely literary magazine founded in the 80s. And Oberon Moore used to edit it, it very well. And I remember I had the Literary Review Christmas lunch on the same day as my training contract's Christmas party. And the law firm where I had my training contract, and I loved the lunch and I loved everybody there, and it was really jolly, and everyone was talking about books, and I just felt at home with those people and with what they were doing. And then I went to the offices, and it was this enormous corporate office, and everyone was in a suit, and I sort of looked around and thought, I can't do this. It's just not me. So that was a real sliding doors moment. I might very well not have gone to the lunch, and then I probably would have ended up doing the contract, and my life would have been very different, because I'd have been a trainee for 2 years. And then
there's a Philip in a horsehair wig somewhere.
Yeah.
In an alternate universe going, I put it to you, my lord.
Yes, exactly. I think though I would have been the kind of barrister that likes to sit in his chambers writing lengthy opinions on learned kind of aspects of the law that
you wouldn't have been in court, maybe. So you opted for something much less lucrative.
Well, I mean, yeah, tell me about it.
What family traits have you inherited?
Good question. So my mother is a journalist, or was a journalist and a writer, and she taught in universities for many years. So she is very organized and read a lot. Was always reading. My primary image of her as a child is of her reading wherever we were, in the playground or whatever, she'd be reading.
While you fall on your head and burst into tears and find a unicorn head,
Exactly. Yeah.
You couldn't get her away from her books.
And my father's family is there were a lot of pianists actually, and my grandmother's mother and her grandmother were all pianists, and I definitely get that from them. So yeah, I've had a lot of lawyers in the family, and they're sort of lawyers, journalists, that kind of thing. A lot of priests. So I think I get that sort of writing bug from all of that. All of those professions involve writing in some way. I had I think it was my great-great-grandfather who used to write to the papers under the pseudonym Alice in Wonderland. So that was a sort of nice, whimsical touch, which I definitely inherited. That sort of slightly, looking at the world through a slightly, distorted lens and seeing its absurdities. I think I definitely got from that.
And what about things that you haven't inherited but you wish you had? Is there any traits you wish you'd inherited?
Making money.
Always a good one.
It's a good question. I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, my grandfather was very, very good with stocks and shares, and he was very, very wise, careful, good investor. And I think I've sort of got a bit of that from him, but I don't have it. I don't have what I don't have is, which is why I don't think I could have been a lawyer, is I don't have the killer instinct. I don't have when I read for the law, I used to like the stories, and I used to think about the people in the stories. I used to think about why they did the things, and I couldn't see it as a legal problem. Do you see what I mean? It was more like I kept seeing the actual people. So when it came to applying the law, I would think, "Oh, well, poor old Sid," and so I never had the killer instinct that as a barrister or a solicitor you need to have. You're pushing your position, and it's the same with that. I think I never quite have the kind of killer instinct to say, right, I'm going to do this, and boo to the consequences.
Do you? For all that, have a kind of another Philip in your mind, something else you could have done, Philip the greengrocer.
Yeah, I mean, Philip the bookseller is a definite parallel life. Yeah, I know. The thing is, I once asked an actual bookseller about this, and she sort of rolled her eyes and said, it's not really that easy. And it was a lovely bookshop. I'm not sure she's still there. It was quite famous, somewhere in Oxfordshire. And I sort of said in passing, "Oh gosh, I've always fantasized about being a bookseller. How lovely it must be." And she sort of sighed and said, it's really difficult. You're opening boxes of books half the day. You get the wrong orders in. You have whole weeks where nobody buys a book. It's really stressful. But in my parallel fantasy life, I have a nice little bookshop that has a secondhand section, and people come in and chat and get the recent books.
I think I do too, and I would have the sort of bookshop that has a sign that says, I might be open, I might not be open. I'll probably open at 11. If I'm not here, go to the pub. But it would be like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it would be the difficulty of keeping opening hours.
Yes.
The actual selling books. I mean, I could just sit in a corner with a book,
I think that's
occasionally sell one. But
what I would do as well is sort of actually probably refuse to sell the books that I was reading to the people who wanted them. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, there were great stories about the wonderful late Pete Burns refusing to sell. He worked in a record shop, and he refused to sell people records. If you're not having that. He was quite legendary, apparently. So I think we'd be the kind of book selling version wouldn't we?
Yeah, we'd,
You know, you
we
kind of
wouldn't
look at
last
the
very
person.
long.
Yeah, you look at the person and think, no, you are not the right person for this book. Okay,
Also,
I'm with you on that.
yeah.
Now we've already established that you're musical. Can you play music when you write, or are you one of these people where it has to be silent?
No, I can't. I can't have anything on at all. If I'm doing something that's technical or administrative, then quite often I'll put on some piano music, but not anything orchestral, because then I'll just get swept away by it. But if I'm actually writing, I have to have silence to the extent that sometimes I get driven mad by. I remember once when I was trying to finish a book for a deadline, and I had the whole house to myself for the weekend, and I went to sit in this room, and somebody was doing some work over there. It was just driving me insane. So I moved into the room over there, and there was work going on the other side of the street, and no, I can't listen to music whilst I'm writing. Has to be quiet.
To go back to pianists, when you do listen to piano music, I mean, is there a pianist who is just for you, like, the equivalent of Tolkien on the keyboards?
Oh, good question. Not really, actually. I mean, I tend to listen more to the composer than the pianist. So I've got at the moment I'm really into sort of Scarlatti and early piano music as well. There's a lovely disc that I've just got, which has got lots of William Byrd and things like that on, like really early keyboard music, and it's very pure and it's very beautiful and clear. But in terms of pianists, I don't have a particular favorite.
How do you beat writer's block? I mean, do you have writer's block? Obviously when there's noise going on all around, that's frustrating. But I mean, when you hit a kind of creative wall, do you have techniques for getting out of that?
I think for me, writer's block usually comes in between projects, and I wouldn't necessarily call it block, more like reluctance, because I think as I get further into my career, I'm a lot more aware of what people will say about a project. So I sort of I've lost that early enthusiasm where you think, oh, this is amazing, you're going to love it. And now I sort of start trying to second guess things and start thinking they're not going to like this because it's too fantasy, or it's too this, or it's too that. It's got there's no market for it or whatever. So that is quite difficult. So I have to train myself to stop thinking like that and to start thinking, well, if I write this and make it really good, then whatever it is, it should find a home. Even if it's not necessarily the most highly marketable thing in the world, then hopefully, if it's really good, people will like it. So how I deal with it is just by carrying on, just like a sort of a habit, really. And I try to do, at the moment I'm writing something, I'm trying to do at least a paragraph a day on it. I try to write longhand, which is in a notebook, and then obviously quite a lot comes out, and then I try to type that up, but I don't always have the time to do that. So if I don't have the time to do that, I'll try and do a paragraph on the computer, and then leave it fairly open-ended so that I kind of have a sense of where it's going, and I sort of have to finish it.
So the ideas don't run out. It's more maybe a little bit of lack of confidence, or not confidence, but you know what I mean. Sort of.
I think you're right. It's lack of confidence. It's lack of self-confidence. It's second guessing, and also the terrible thing that I think all writers do, which is looking at your contemporaries and seeing how amazingly they're doing, and then thinking sort of which and then again you have to sort of say to yourself, well, different circumstances, different publishers, different people. So I think, like all writers, certainly I have an instinctive need to write, which doesn't go away. So even if in the circumstances that hopefully I'll be publishing books for the rest of my life, but if I didn't, then I would still be writing. I wouldn't stop. I'd still try and finish whatever it was that I was doing.
Do you ever kind of, because it is fantasy and very imaginative literature, do you ever kind of write yourself into an impasse where you sort of think, oh my God, there's so many plates spinning. How do I get out of this? You know, or your character is in something where you thought, oh God, I didn't really work out how I was going to extricate them from this situation.
Yeah, that happens all the time. I think even if I plan novels, which I mean, I don't plan them in great detail, but I always have an idea of the basic structure. I think you couldn't write a book unless you did. I mean, maybe wrong on that. There may be some people who can do it, but I always know what the beginning and the middle and the end are. But it's how they get there that's interesting. And obviously, things develop. And what happens with me, which is, I suppose, what you might call the unconscious or subconscious or spooky part of writing, is that you might introduce a character who's holding something or doing something, and then suddenly it becomes very significant why that person's holding an orange or whatever it is, you know. So that has just happened to me, where I have just got my two main characters into a place where I didn't expect them to be, where instead of being chased by one person, then they're being chased by a knight from a different dimension,
of course,
but they're also now being chased by about 20 humans who want them for a different reason. So I suddenly thought to myself, what am I doing? But then the thing is that, you know, and it's such a kind of writing school cliche, but, you know, raising the stakes, and I think that as you're writing, you just raise the stakes unconsciously without even thinking about it, because that's how you keep the reader engaged. You know, it's throwing surprises at them, and then of course it makes you become inventive, because you've got to get them out of it. So you test things and see if it's going to work, and then I think it makes your writing better.
So many writers say that, by the way. That
do they? Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, there's something that they've mentioned sort of 100 pages ago, and it's like, so that's why he had a spanner. You know?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, well, you mentioned an orange. What is your favourite sort of reward? Do you have a snack that either powers you or you have as a little reward when you've finished your paragraph, your toast?
Finished my paragraph. Actually, that's a really good question. I mean, there's a lovely bakery up the road from me, which does delicious Coronation Chicken sandwiches. And they're really expensive. They cost about £7, but about maybe once a fortnight, after I think that I deserve it, then I allow myself a Coronation Chicken sandwich. But also Scotch egg. A good Scotch egg is a good treat for lunch, because I tend to write in the morning, so I sort of usually, you know, that's the reward. And then of course, if you finish in the evening, then a nice glass of wine or a gin and tonic is the
Yes. Whether that paragraph has been written or not, it's time for a G&T. It's so funny about Coronation Chicken, isn't it? I mean, when was that? The 1950s or something? And it's still delicious.
Oh, so good.
I don't eat chicken anymore, but, you know, that was a classic recipe, and yet it's sort of naff. I mean, I'm sure, you know, what is it, stirring curry powder into mayonnaise?
It's so naff. But naffness is never...
What a winner. Thank you, Liz. How do you celebrate when you finish a first draft?
How do I celebrate when I finish a first draft? That, again, is a really interesting question.
Is it a thing, finishing a first draft, or do you sort of go, oh my God, there's so much still to do?
No, it's very much a thing, because you suddenly realize that you can do it, and particularly so the stage that I'm at now with the manuscripts is about 22,000 words in, and most children's books are about 50,000-60,000 words, so I'm about a third of the way through, and that seems almost insurmountable. There's something about that particular point in a narrative, and usually what happens is that I'll get to that point, find it insurmountable, get through it, and then gallop along to the end, and then stop at the end and think, oh, actually, how does this end? And so when you actually finish it, it's a huge sense of relief, and definitely worth celebrating. I think lots of people online will always announce that they've done it, and I think that's because you feel like you need a pat on the back. It's how I celebrate it it varies. I suppose a concomitant question to that would be, or answer really, would be that when I used to get a book deal in the old days, I'd go out and have lunch with a friend and drink a bottle of champagne. Now I just sort of say, oh, right, great, that's another book deal. On we go with the next one. So I suppose the more you do it, the more you become habituated to it. But it's still a milestone. I think finishing a first draft is absolutely a milestone.
Well, if you remember back in the day, one would be taken out for lunch.
Yeah, those were the days.
I wonder if that still happens. Not to anybody I know. Not to me. So when do you think this, have you got a deadline for this book, or have you got just a deadline in your mind, or it happens when it happens? How does that work?
I'm trying to set myself a deadline. So I did 2 books, Wild Role and Ghost Lord, which were a sort of, not a trilogy, but a sort of duology. Is that even a thing, a duology? They kind of, they're a pair of books. They bounce off each other. The second one is not necessarily a sequel to the first, but it contains some of the same characters, and so that was a contract. There was a 2-book contract, so that's finished. So now I'm trying to do something for the next lot of books. So there's no defined date in terms of the publishers, but it's more about me setting myself a deadline and saying I've got to do this by the end of the year. Which I think currently is my thinking, that I'm trying to at least get a first draft by June and then second draft by December.
And from what you've learnt in the past from how you write, that's doable. That's not pie in the sky.
I think so. I can, being a freelance, obviously I can arrange my days so that today I have about 3 or 4 hours this afternoon that I can devote to just writing the book, so that'll be more than a paragraph. whereas tomorrow I'm out doing a school visit, so that'll probably be a few lines. So that's just how it kind of pans out.
So my last question: what do you wish you had known about publishing before you embarked on this career? What would you tell your younger self?
What would I tell my younger self?
Maybe that 14-year-old, so proud of himself for writing a vampire novel.
A terrible vampire novel. In which I recall it was the teachers that were the vampires, and it was down to the main character to sort of point this out. And I mean, it was a total mess. There wasn't much of a plot, and I seem to remember introducing characters from ancient Egypt at one point.
Why not? Well, Anne Rice did the same thing, actually.
Well, I think that's why I did it.
Yeah.
A straightforward case of copying, or imitatio, as the Romans would have it. What would I say to my younger self? What would I know? Well, I think the thing that I didn't know, and I think that most romantic young writers who go into the writing world don't necessarily grasp, is that it is a business. And I think and certainly, and I think the two things can exist in tandem with each other. I think it's possible to be romantic about something whilst also understanding that it's a business. And I think if you look at the career of William Shakespeare, for instance, I mean, he was aware of business when he was also an incredibly imaginative writer. And I don't think it shows publishing in a bad light, if you see what I mean. It's just how it works. I think if I'd understood more about that side of things, I think I would have done things differently. But that's something that creative writing courses tend to teach now. There's usually a publishing element or a sort of business element. So I think the new generation of writers coming out of those courses, I mean, whether those courses should exist or not is another question, but the new generation of writers coming out, they seem much more business savvy, much more aware of what they're doing, and like creating a brand and understanding what to post on Twitter and all that sort of thing. And I've always been a bit vague about that sort of thing. I think it would be better to have more of a kind of tighter focus on what was on the business side of it, basically.
All those courses might be severely cut now, mightn't they? I mean, cuts in the humanities, and there might be a lot fewer creative writing courses.
But that's true, but then they're quite cheap to run, creative writing courses. They don't cost very much, so and they're popular. So we'll see.
Well, I mean, they are popular, but you know, the scale of debt you might get into. So the position might change a little bit. And I've done a bit of teaching for creative writing students, teaching about the business. And one of the questions that nearly everybody wants to know is, what say do you have over your covers? Any or none? I mean, I think people think that you get to say, not that one. But a lot of writers say, oh no, you just get... I mean, I've heard people get said, what's your idea about this cover? And you very heavily get the idea that they want you to say, yes, it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously each publisher is different. I've been very lucky with all of my covers. I've always almost immediately liked them. I think the smaller the publisher, the more sort of say you might have in it. I mean, not you can't say yes or no necessarily because they've hired the person and all that sort of thing. But yes, no, that's generally speaking, the cover is the publisher's choice, as it should be, because they know how to market things and they know what works and what doesn't work. So, I mean, the cover, it's interesting because it's such an intrinsic part of how we remember books and how we picture books, how we experience books. But actually, the writer tends to have very little input into it whatsoever.
I mean, one of my favourite books is Smith by Leon Garfield. And it's very much tied up with the original illustrations, wonderful line illustrations that sort of wrap around the page. I can't remember the name of the illustrator, but it's so tied up with the book. And then the Narnia covers, they are, the one for Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, where they're dancing with Aslan. I mean, that's just incredible, isn't it? You can't peel that away from the book, can you?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's in that funny way when they change illustrators, and which they did actually with the Roald Dahl books, because Quentin Blake didn't illustrate the early books, and so when I was little, we had Charlie and the Chocolate Factory with completely different illustrations in it, and then somehow I saw a Quentin Blake illustrated Charlie the other day, and I thought, well, that's not right. It doesn't seem quite right. So it's very strange how those two things interact, but it's interesting. There's a sort of alchemy when it works.
Well, there's the other thing with it's more important for children's books, obviously, because there's the whole thing about whether it has illustrations or whether it doesn't have illustrations. And I remember that's how I used to differentiate who reviews what in terms of children's book. Does it have pictures? Then this person went, does it not have pictures? Then it will go that way. Doesn't Alice say something about books that don't have
the use of books that don't have any pictures or conversations? Yeah,
that's it.
Quite right too.
Yeah, Lewis Carroll knew what he was on about, didn't he? No creative blocks for him. No.
My favourite story about Lewis Carroll is that I'm a big fan of Lewis Carroll, and I probably won't go into all of the things that people say about him, but my favourite story about Lewis Carroll is that when Queen Victoria asked for the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, he sent her his next book, which happened to be a very dense treatise on mathematics. He asked for his next book, and that's what it was, you know.
Yeah. Wow. Yes. And then he goes and writes something that has a sort of very fierce and mean queen in it.
Yeah,
so
yeah. Well, I mean, you know, that's the lovely thing about the Alice books, is that, you know, the Queen, Prince Leopold was at Christchurch, and the Queen Victoria would have been there, and croquet was just coming into its infancy, and there were genuinely dozens of different ways of playing croquet, so it was entirely possible to attend a croquet match and not know how to play it. You know, there's a lot of actual resonant contemporary stuff in Alice in Wonderland and in Through the Looking Glass, which is absolutely fascinating.
Yes, all of his paradoxes, philosophical conundrums, and all of that kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, it sort of goes back to what we were saying earlier about things for adults that are in kids' books.
Well, he was one day when I have the time, I'm going to write about Neoplatonism in children's fiction. But he also, I mean,
I'd be up for that. I think that's a great idea.
Like C.S. Lewis, he had that similar kind of Neoplatonic idea of Christianity, and you can see it in the idea of the king dreaming. Who's dreaming? The king. Is it the king dreaming us, or us? You know, there's this sense that there are other layers of reality, and what are they moving towards? What are they hiding? And what's in the mirror world? What is it moving towards? And I think all of that is really interesting and worth further exploring.
I think you should. I think, yes, we will expect that from you. You know, you can write that in 2026.
I think it's going to be one of those things that I'll do when I've retired.
Right. Okay. Don't retire just yet. We need you to keep on. Well, thank you very much for joining me again. It's been lovely catching up and hearing about this next project. So, yeah, I think you've deserved your Coronation Chicken sandwich today, Philip. I will let you go, but first write your paragraph.
I will. Don't worry. I'm going to do it now.
Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Suzi.
Thank you for joining us. That has been a lot of fun. I'll be asking all those questions of various new people in the bag and some people who've been in the bag before. Let's see what they have to say. So, oranges, Coronation Chicken, Scarlatti, Neoplatonism in children's books. We've really covered a lot today. So thank you for listening and watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Like and subscribe if you can, and I'll see you next time.